Welcome to Strategic Affairs. In the heart of London, where centuries of history sit layered over every street and every brick, a new story has begun to unfold, one that is not written in monuments or museums, but in secrets, whispers, and the quiet calculations of powerful nations. This is the story of China's ambitious plan to build its largest European embassy at the old Royal Mint site in Tower Hamlets, and the storm it has unleashed in Britain. At first glance, it might seem like nothing more than a construction project, but the deeper you look, the more this story reveals what lies beneath the surface. Hidden fears, espionage, suspicions, local anger, and a clash between two very different worlds. The Royal Mint site, once a proud symbol of British power and wealth, was chosen for this grand embassy. For Beijing, it was a prize location. The embassy would not only handle visas and consular services, but also stand as a statement of power and unmistakable mark of China's growing influence in global affairs. Blueprints revealed a sprawling complex, with offices, halls for cultural events, and even underground facilities. To Chinese officials, this was more than an office. It was a fortress of prestige. To London, however, it soon began to look like something far more dangerous. From the very beginning, questions were raised. Why here, so close to the beating heart of Britain's government, financial institutions, and transport hubs? Why such a massive structure, reinforced and designed with multiple underground levels? Was this just an embassy, or something more? The whispers of espionage, cyber surveillance, and hidden agendas began to spread. Britain, still struggling with its relationship with Beijing after years of tension over Hong Kong, Xinjiang, and Huawei's 5G ban, found itself staring at a test it could not easily ignore. Embassies have always been unusual places. By international law, they are considered sovereign territory of the nation they represent. That means once inside an embassy, you are legally standing on foreign soil. Throughout history, embassies have been both sanctuaries of diplomacy and shelters for espionage. During the Cold War, embassies were filled with listening devices, secret tunnels, and covert operatives disguised as diplomats. In today's world, espionage has moved into new territory: digital surveillance, cyber hacking, data collection, and many in Britain feared that China's embassy might become one of the most advanced intelligence hubs in Europe. Local politicians and intelligence officials grew uneasy. The Royal Mint site was dangerously close to government buildings and communication lines. Surveillance experts warned that sophisticated equipment could easily be installed within embassy walls, equipment invisible to the naked eye but capable of monitoring sensitive information. One analyst warned that what looked like a simple office block could in reality be a digital fortress, gathering data from London's most important institutions. In an era where information is power, that possibility was terrifying. At the same time, the people of Tower Hamlets had their own fears. Their community was already struggling with overcrowding, housing shortages, and stretched public services. A massive embassy complex, with heavy security, constant protests, and a permanent police presence, would only make daily life harder. Residents wondered why their neighborhood should carry the burden of global politics. Some demanded the land be used instead for affordable housing or public spaces. For them, the embassy was not a symbol of diplomacy, it was an intrusion, an unwelcome neighbor with consequences that would ripple through their lives. As news spread, protests began to grow. Some were small groups holding banners, warning of spies in London. Others were more organized, with community leaders demanding the project be scrapped entirely. Council meetings, voices rose, accusing the government of ignoring the local community in favor of geopolitical games. Slowly, the issue transformed from a quiet planning application into a national debate. The media took hold of the story, and soon the entire country was asking, should Britain allow China to build such a massive diplomatic stronghold in its capital? Behind closed doors, the government struggled with its options. Blocking the embassy outright would anger Beijing, risking retaliation against British interests abroad. Allowing it to proceed would invite criticism at home and potentially create a long-term security risk. Officials debated conditions. Could they limit the scale of the project? Could they impose restrictions on technology or underground facilities? Every option seemed to carry both costs and risks. Ministers found themselves caught between two fires: protect national security or maintain fragile diplomatic ties. Meanwhile, Beijing reacted with visible frustration. Chinese diplomats insisted the new embassy was a necessity, not a luxury. They argued that their current building in Portland Place was too small and outdated to handle the growing demand for visas and consular services. They dismissed fears of espionage as absurd, calling them the product of paranoia and anti-China sentiment. In public statements, they reminded Britain that embassies exist to build friendship, not suspicion. But behind the polite words, there was also a warning: blocking the embassy could damage relations beyond repair. The story gained even more heat when leaks appeared in the press. Secret government cables, whispered about by journalists, revealed that Britain's intelligence services had serious concerns, though the documents remained classified. Sources claimed they described vulnerabilities that China could exploit if its embassy was allowed to rise in Tower Hamlets. Suddenly, what had been speculation seemed more like confirmed fear. The public began to see the embassy not as a diplomatic project but as a direct threat to Britain's sovereignty. And so, what began as a blueprint for a new building turned into a battlefield of ideas. For some, it was about defending national security. For others, it was about protecting a local community. For China, it was about respect, recognition, and the right to expand its global footprint. And for Britain, it was about navigating a storm where every choice seemed to come with consequences. This was the beginning of a controversy that would shake London, divide opinions, and ripple across the world. The Royal Mint site became more than land. It became a symbol of power, of fear, and of the quiet but fierce battles hidden beneath diplomacy's surface. The debate around China's new embassy in London did not fade. It grew louder, sharper, and far more dangerous. What had started as a planning issue in Tower Hamlets now reached the very heart of Westminster. Parliament, intelligence agencies, and the British press were locked into a storm that refused to die down. Every few days, new details came to light. Former intelligence officers began to speak out. Some described how, during the Cold War, embassies were built like fortresses of deception. They reminded the public of the American embassy in Moscow, discovered to be filled with hidden Soviet listening devices. If that could happen to the United States, they argued, why couldn't it happen here in Britain with China? These warnings were not dismissed as old paranoia. They hit too close to home. China, after all, was no ordinary partner. Relations had already been scarred by years of tension. Britain had accused Beijing of breaking its promises over Hong Kong, crushing freedoms once guaranteed under the one country, two systems deal. British intelligence had pointed fingers at Chinese hackers, accusing them of cyber attacks on sensitive networks. The decision to ban Huawei from Britain's 5G infrastructure had been another open wound. Now allowing Beijing to build Europe's largest embassy in the very heart of London seemed, to many, like surrendering the city's security. The government tried to calm the storm. Ministers repeated that all planning applications were subject to review and that Britain would take its national security seriously. Yet behind closed doors, reports suggested the debate was fierce. Intelligence services warned of potential surveillance from embassy rooftops, underground tunnels for covert operations, and the possibility that the embassy could become a command hub for digital espionage across Europe. These were not small risks. They were long-term threats that could shape the balance of power in ways invisible to ordinary citizens. At the same time, local resistance hardened. Tower Hamlets residents organized marches, community meetings, and petitions. They spoke not only of security fears but of how the embassy would transform their neighborhood. A fortress-like building, guarded day and night, would mean constant police presence, road closures, and surveillance cameras. It would draw protests from human rights groups, adding tension to daily life. Parents worried about their children, walking to school past potential protest flashpoints. Shopkeepers feared their businesses would suffer. For many, the embassy was not only China's problem or Britain's, it was their problem. Their streets, their future. Media outlets poured fuel on the fire. Front pages carried headlines like China's fortress in London and spies at the Royal Mint. Television documentaries highlighted local anger and interviewed experts who spoke of a hidden war being fought through embassies on social media. The debate was even more heated. Hashtags trended. Conspiracy theories spread, and every new protest outside the Royal Mint site was filmed, shared, and argued about endlessly. Inside Westminster, members of Parliament clashed. Some argued that blocking the embassy would send a strong message that Britain would not bow to foreign intimidation. Others warned that rejecting the project could spark economic retaliation, with Beijing cutting trade deals, investment, or even targeting British citizens in China. Every argument came down to the same painful truth. Whatever Britain decided, the consequences would be severe. The Chinese embassy project also drew attention from abroad. American analysts warned Britain not to underestimate Beijing's ambitions. European neighbors watched closely. Some worried that if London allowed such a fortress, they might be pressured to do the same. Chinese state media, meanwhile, framed the controversy as evidence of Western hostility, accusing Britain of stirring up Cold War hysteria. Beijing's message was clear. They would not quietly accept rejection. As the weeks passed, it became obvious that this was not just about one building. It was about the future of Britain's relationship with China, about sovereignty, and about whether a democratic state could stand firm against an authoritarian power without igniting open confrontation. The Royal Mint site had become a stage where these larger forces played out, every actor delivering their lines under the glare of public attention. But in the shadows, beyond the noise of protests and debates, another question grew louder. What exactly was being built beneath the surface? Reports hinted at underground facilities included in the embassy's design. What were they for? Storage, secure communications rooms, or something far more secretive? To critics, the underground construction symbolized the hidden side of the project, the part no one could see. Yet everyone feared, one intelligence source told a journalist. It's not what you see above the ground that matters. It's what you don't see beneath it. Those words spread like wildfire, appearing in newspapers, blogs, and online debates. To the public, it seemed like confirmation that Britain might be sitting on a ticking time bomb. In the heart of this storm, one thing became clear. The embassy was no longer just a plan. It was a mirror, reflecting back all of Britain's anxieties about China, about its own weakened global role, and about a world where lines between diplomacy and espionage were almost impossible to separate. And as Parliament prepared to vote on whether to approve, reject, or delay the project, both sides of the debate knew this was not just about bricks and mortar. It was about trust, fear, and power, and about whether London's skyline would soon include a building seen not as a symbol of peace, but as a shadow over Britain's future. As the months dragged on, the embassy project no longer felt like a future plan. It had become a full-blown crisis. The Royal Mint site stood quiet, but its silence carried a weight. Behind the boarded fences and abandoned walls of history, Britain and China were wrestling in a battle of words, threats, and strategies. What had started as a planning dispute was now shaping foreign policy, national security, and the very identity of Britain on the global stage. Inside the halls of Westminster, tension rose with every debate. The government was under fire from all directions. Some MPs demanded a total halt to the project, arguing that Britain could not risk turning Tower Hamlets into a surveillance hub for Beijing. Others suggested compromise, limiting the size, restricting underground facilities, or imposing strict surveillance of their own. But compromise, some warned, was an illusion. Once the embassy was built, Britain would have little control over what happened behind its walls. Leaks began to surface. Journalists whispered of confidential documents from MI5 and MI6. Though never fully revealed, the reports painted a picture of deep concern. Sources claimed the embassy could house advanced communication systems capable of intercepting signals. Across London, they suggested it might serve as a base for cyber operations, collecting information not only from government offices but also from Britain's financial institutions and even its allies. To the public, it felt like confirmation of their worst fears. China's embassy wasn't just a building, it was a weapon. Taught in Tower Hamlets, local anger grew into something larger. The residents who once complained of housing shortages and neighborhood disruption now found themselves caught in the middle of a geopolitical battle. Activists joined their protests, linking the embassy to wider concerns about China's human rights abuses in Xinjiang and Hong Kong. Demonstrations grew larger, more emotional, with banners reading "No spy base in our streets and homes, not embassies." Night after night, TV screens across Britain showed images of ordinary people shouting against one of the world's most powerful nations. But these protests also attracted another kind of attention. Countergroups, often small but vocal, appeared to defend the embassy. Some accused critics of fueling anti-China hysteria, while others framed it as racism against the local Chinese community. This clash of narratives made the story even more combustible. What had begun as a dispute about a building now touched on race, identity, and the deep divisions within Britain itself. Meanwhile, in Beijing, the patience of Chinese officials was running thin. Through official channels, they demanded Britain honor its obligations under diplomatic law. They reminded London that every nation has the right to construct embassies, and that blocking this project would be an insult not just to China but to the very principles of diplomacy. State media thundered with headlines calling Britain's objections hypocrisy. Commentators accused London of bowing to American pressure, portraying the embassy dispute as yet another example of Western countries trying to contain China's rise. But while the words were public, the pressure behind the scenes was far more intense. Reports suggested Beijing hinted at economic retaliation. Trade deals could be delayed, investment could dry up, British companies in China might face new obstacles. Diplomats feared that the fallout would not stop there, that ordinary British citizens living and working in China could be caught in the crossfire. The British government, already fragile after years of political turmoil, now stood at a breaking point. Every option seemed to lead toward disaster. Approving the embassy would trigger outrage at home and raise deep security risks. Blocking it outright could spark retaliation abroad. Delaying might only drag out the crisis, keeping tensions simmering without resolution. And then came the bombshell. A whistleblower, a former contractor who had allegedly worked on parts of the embassy's design, came forward anonymously. In interviews with the press, he described features that sent shockwaves through the public. He spoke of reinforced underground chambers, communications wiring that seemed far too advanced for normal diplomatic work, and architectural designs that resembled fortified compounds rather than offices. Though the claims could not be fully verified, they added gasoline to the fire. People no longer wondered if the embassy might be a spy hub. They began to believe it already was designed to be one. The story spiraled. International outlets from the New York Times to France's Le Monde picked it up, framing London as the new front line in a hidden war between China and the West. Analysts warned that if Britain allowed the embassy to rise, other European capitals could face similar pressure. The Royal Mint site was no longer a local issue. It had become a global test case. Behind the curtain, intelligence officials scrambled to prepare for the worst. Contingency plans were drawn up. Could Britain monitor the embassy's activities? Could countermeasures block surveillance signals? Could cyber defenses withstand attacks? The quiet war of preparation was as intense as the public debate, yet invisible to the people whose future depended on the outcome. For the residents of Tower Hamlets, the pressure was unbearable. Their community had become a symbol of an international clash they never asked for. Parents worried about safety, businesses feared boycotts, and every street corner seemed to buzz with uncertainty. The phrase, "What lies beneath," became a haunting reminder, not only of the embassy's underground chambers, but also of the layers of secrecy, fear, and suspicion buried beneath London's proud streets. And still, no decision had been made. The government delayed, debated, and hesitated, caught in the impossible balance between national security and global diplomacy. But everyone knew the moment of choice was coming. Britain could not remain in limbo forever. The embassy project had begun as an architectural plan. Now it was a battle of survival, political, diplomatic, and perhaps even existential. The question was no longer simply about construction. It was about whether Britain had the strength to stand firm in the face of China's rise, and whether the world's oldest democracy could protect itself from the shadows creeping beneath its own soil. As autumn settled over London, the embassy crisis reached a boiling point. The quiet walls of Westminster echoed with urgent meetings, classified briefings, and hushed arguments. Ministers walked with heavy files under their arms, their faces stern, their words carefully measured. It was clear to everyone the moment of decision had arrived. The Royal Mint site, fenced and silent, had become a mirror of Britain's indecision. It was a battlefield without soldiers, a front line marked by blueprints and planning papers, but the stakes were far greater than construction. This was about sovereignty, survival, and the question of whether Britain could resist pressure from both Beijing and Washington without collapsing under the weight. The government's final intelligence review was damning. Behind closed doors, officials admitted that the risks of espionage were substantial and long-term. The embassy, once operational, could create surveillance threats not just in London but across the United Kingdom. The underground levels, the advanced communications, the fortress-like design all pointed to a future where Britain's most sensitive data could be within reach of a foreign power. Yet the diplomatic risks were equally grave. Rejecting the embassy outright could trigger a storm with Beijing. China, the world's second-largest economy, had countless levers of influence. British exports could suffer, joint projects could collapse, and citizens abroad could face retaliation. The United States, meanwhile, quietly urged Britain to stand strong. American intelligence reports warned that if London allowed this embassy to be built, it could set a precedent for Chinese influence across Europe. For Washington, this was not just Britain's fight, it was part of a much larger struggle for global power. In Tower Hamlets, residents waited anxiously. For them, the debate was personal, close to home. They had marched, shouted, and protested, demanding their voices be heard. To many, the embassy represented disruption, danger, and the loss of their community. To others, it was a symbol of something bigger, the creeping feeling that local lives no longer mattered in the shadow of great powers. Then came the vote. Local councils had already rejected the embassy plans, but the ultimate choice rested with the national government. In a tense announcement, the government declared that it would not move forward with China's embassy as originally designed. Security concerns, they said, were too great. The statement was measured, carefully worded to avoid direct confrontation. But the message was clear. Britain had chosen caution over compromise. Beijing's reaction was swift. Officials condemned the decision as discriminatory, accusing Britain of politicizing a simple diplomatic project. Chinese state media painted London as a puppet of Washington, framing the rejection as proof of Western hostility toward China's rise. Behind the sharp words, however, there was calculation. China knew it could retaliate, but it also knew escalation carried risks. The embassy plan was stalled, but the larger contest between East and West was far from over. In Britain, the announcement sparked mixed emotions. Security experts praised the decision, calling it a necessary step to protect national sovereignty. Residents of Tower Hamlets celebrated in the streets, waving signs that read victory for the people. Yet others worried about the cost. Business leaders warned that China might punish Britain economically. Diplomats whispered that the damage to relations could take years to repair. But beyond the noise of politics, a deeper truth lingered. The embassy controversy had revealed something larger than itself. It showed how a single building could become a symbol of mistrust, a stage for global rivalries, and a reminder of the fragility of diplomacy in an age of suspicion. The Royal Mint site remained empty, its future uncertain. Some suggested it should be used for affordable housing, others dreamed of turning it into a cultural center. But no matter what came next, the land had already been transformed. It was no longer just a patch of London, it was a battlefield of ideas, a reminder of how fragile trust had become in international relations and in the halls of power. Officials knew this was not the end. The battle over the embassy was just one chapter in a much larger story. The rivalry between Britain and China, between the West and Beijing, was only beginning to intensify. From cyber warfare to economic pressure, from military alliances to cultural influence, the struggle for dominance would continue to shape the decades ahead. For the people of London, the lesson was haunting. They had seen global politics arrive at their doorstep, transforming their neighborhood into the front line of a new kind of war, a war fought not with tanks or missiles, but with buildings, blueprints, and invisible networks of power. The question that remained was simple, yet terrifying. If one embassy could cause this much turmoil, what storms lay ahead as the world's great powers wrestled for control of the future? The silence over the Royal Mint site carried no answers. Only the shadows remained, stretching long into the night, whispering of secrets, fears, and the battles yet to come.